The nature of cognitive psychology. Earlier, we saw how the inclusion of cognitive factors in the social learning theories of Albert Bandura and Julian Rotter altered American behaviorism. Today, it is not only in behavioral psychology that the cognitive movement has an impact. Cognitive factors have affected virtually all areas: social psychology, motivation and emotion, personality, learning, memory, perception, problem solving, creativity, and information processing. Applied areas such as clinical, community, school, and industrial organizational psychology have also seen a great enhancement of emphasis on cognitive factors. Cognitive psychology differs from behaviorism on several points. First, cognitive psychologists focus on the process of knowing rather than responding to stimuli. The important factors are mental processes and events, not stimulus response connections. The emphasis is on the mind, not behavior. This does not mean that cognitive psychologists ignore behavior, but behavioral responses are not the sole focus of their research. Behavioral responses are sources for making inferences and drawing conclusions about the mental processes accompanying them. Second, cognitive psychologists are interested in how the mind organizes experience. Gestalt psychologists, as well as Piaget, argued in favor of an innate tendency to organize conscious experiences, sensations, and perceptions into meaningful wholes and patterns. The mind gives form and coherence to mental experience. This process is the subject matter of cognitive psychology. British empiricists and associationists and their 20th century derivatives, the Skinnerian behaviorists, insisted that the mind did not possess inherent organizational abilities. Third, cognitive psychologists believe that we have the ability to actively and creatively arrange the stimuli received from our environment. We are capable of participating in the acquisition and application of knowledge, deliberately attending to some events, and choosing to commit them to memory. We are not, however, as the behaviorist claimed, passive responders to external forces or blank slates on which sensory experience will write. Cognitive neuroscience. Research on mapping various parts of the brain dates from the 18th and 19th centuries and the work of Hall and Braca, using methods such as extirpation and electrical stimulation. Early physiologists attempted to determine the specific parts of the brain that controlled various cognitive functions. That same quest continues today in the 21st century in the discipline called cognitive neuroscience, a hybrid of cognitive psychology and the neurosciences. The goals of this field, cognitive neuroscience, is to determine how brain functions give rise to mental activity and to correlate specific aspects of information processing with specific brain regions. Researchers in cognitive neuroscience have made striking advances in mapping the brain, largely due to the development and application of sophisticated imaging techniques. For example, the electroencephalogram, the EEG, records variations in electrical activity in selected parts of the brain. Computerized axial tomography, or CAT, scans reveal detailed cross sections of the brain. Magnetic resonance imagery, or MRI, scans produce three-dimensional pictures of the brain, whereas these techniques produce still images. Positron emission tomography, PET, or PET scans provide live pictures of cognitive activities as they occur. These and other imaging techniques provide scientists with a degree of precision and detail that was not previously attainable. Concerning a new phrenology, great strides are being made in precisely determining which parts of the brain control various cognitive and personality functions. The field has even been referred to, only half-jokingly, as the new phrenology. We noted earlier that reading the brain by feeling the bumps and ridges on a person's skull was immensely popular in both Europe and the United States in the 19th century. Now, in the 21st century, a psychologist wrote that phrenology may be undergoing a redemption of sorts. Not the skull part, that's still considered bunk, but neuroscientists are using their new tools to revisit and explore the idea that different personality traits are localized in different brain regions. For example, the personality traits of extroversion, conscientiousness, and agreeableness have been consistently found by studies using MRIs in the same region of the brain. Other research is identifying specific areas of the brain associated with depression. Cognitive neuroscientists have demonstrated that the human brain can exert control over a computer and even through a computer over another person. In other words, thought can be translated into movement by electrical brain impulses alone. The first subject for a demonstration of this kind was a 25-year-old man who had been totally paralyzed for the last 3 years. Electronic sensors implanted in the motor cortex of his brain were interfaced with a computer, allowing him to control not only the computer, but also a television set and a robot, all by using his thoughts only. Within minutes, he had learned to move the computer's cursor, allowing him to open email, move objects using a robotic arm, play a simple video game, and draw a crude circle on the screen. He exercised this control by thinking about, that is, by willing or intending to make such movements. He could not, of course, move any controls with his hands. This application of cognitive neuroscience, called neuroprosthetics, offers the hope that people with these types of disabilities could one day be able to interact with and exercise control over objects in their environment. In another experiment, a subject was able to send a brain signal over the internet to control the hand movement of another person. The sender played a video game on his computer. When he was supposed to make a movement with his right hand to initiate an action on the screen, he held it still and only imagined that he was moving his hand. Across campus, the other subject, wearing an electrical stimulation coil over his motor cortex, found that his right index finger moved involuntarily on his keyboard to initiate the movement in the video game that the first subject was thinking of doing. Cognitive psychologists and their acceptance of conscious experiences led them to reconsider psychology's first research approach, the introspective method that had been introduced by Wundt well over 100 years before. In a statement that could have been written by Wundt or Titchener, a psychologist in the late 20th century wrote, "If we are to study consciousness, we must use introspection and introspective reports." More recently, other psychologists affirmed that introspection is indispensable to psychology. Having been banned by the behaviorists for decades, introspection is now back in the running as the premier method of psychology. Cognitive psychologists attempt to quantify introspective reports so as to render them more objective and therefore amenable to statistical analyses. One approach, retrospective phenomenological assessment, involves asking subjects to rate the intensity of their subjective experiences while responding to a previous stimulus situation. In other words, subjects retrospectively evaluate the subjective experiences that occurred during an earlier period when they were asked to respond to a given stimulus. A leading cognitive psychologist noted that not only is introspection widely used, but that the conscious states revealed by introspection are often good predictors of people's behavior. Although some form of introspection is now once again the most frequently used research method in contemporary psychology, even its strongest adherents recognize its limitations in the 21st century. For example, some subjects may give socially desirable introspective reports by telling researchers what they think the researchers want to hear in an effort to please them. Another problem with introspection is that subjects may not be able to access some of their thoughts or feelings because these reside deep in the unconscious, a topic to which psychologists are also devoting renewed attention. Concerning unconscious cognition, the study of conscious mental processes sparked a renewal of interest in unconscious cognitive activities. After 100 years of neglect, suspicion, and frustration, unconscious processes have now taken a firm hold on the collective mind of psychologists. Increasingly, cognitive psychologists agree that the unconscious is able to accomplish many functions that were once thought to require conscious awareness. Research suggests now that much of our thinking and information processing takes place initially in the unconscious, which may operate more quickly and efficiently than the conscious mind. However, this is not the unconscious mind of which Freud spoke, overflowing with repressed desires and memories brought into conscious awareness only through psychoanalysis. The new unconscious of cognitive psychology is more rational than emotional and is involved in the first stage of cognitive cognition in responding to a stimulus. Thus, unconscious processes are now seen to form an integral part of learning and can be studied experimentally. To distinguish the modern version of the cognitive unconscious from the psychoanalytic version and from the physical states of being unaware, asleep, or comatose, some cognitive psychologists prefer the term non-conscious. In general, cognitive researchers agree that much human mental processing occurs at a non-conscious level. A smart unconscious or a smart non-conscious. It now appears that the unconscious is smarter than first thought, capable of processing complex verbal and visual information and even anticipating and planning for future events. No longer simply a repository for drives and impulses, the unconscious or non-conscious appears to play a role in problem solving, hypothesis testing, and creativity. In both laboratory experiments and observational studies of consumer purchasing behavior, researchers have found that non-conscious or unconscious thought, deliberation without intention, was more creative and diverse and led to purchases with which people were more satisfied than when the laboratory responses and purchasing behavior were directed by conscious thought. A popular approach to studying non-conscious processing involves subliminal perception, or subliminal activation, in which stimuli are presented below the subject's levels of conscious awareness. Despite the subject's inability to consciously perceive those stimuli, the stimuli activate the subject's conscious processes and behavior. Thus, this type of research shows that we can be influenced by stimuli that we can neither see or hear. These and similar findings have persuaded cognitive psychologists that the process of acquiring knowledge in or out of the laboratory setting takes place at both conscious and non-conscious levels, but that most of the mental work involved in learning occurs at the non-conscious level. However, having established the importance of unconscious cognition, psychologists are careful to point out that the role of consciousness in information processing continues to be of major importance. Animal cognition, the return of animals who think. The cognitive movement restored consciousness not only to humans but to animals as well. Animal psychology and comparative psychology have come full circle from observations of animal mental life reported by Romanes and Morgan in the 1880s and 1890s through the mechanical stimulus response or SR conditioning research of B.F. Skinner behaviorists in the 1950s and 60s to the contemporary restoration of consciousness by cognitive psychologists. This return to animal consciousness was given formal status with the starting of a journal called Animal Cognition in 1998. 1998 was also the year that Google was founded and created. In 2014, an APA journal called the Journal of Experimental Psychology, with the subtitle Animal Behavior Processes, changed its name to recognize the importance of animal cognition. The Journal of Experimental Psychology, with the subtitle Animal Learning and Cognition. And that was published by Miller in 2014, the year before my high school graduation. And then, of course, Google was created in 1998, the year after my birth. Notice that there is no longer any mention of behavior in the new title. Since the 1970s, animal psychologists have been demonstrating how animals encode, transform, compute, and manipulate symbolic representations of real-world spatial, temporal, and causal textures for the purposes of adaptively organizing their behavior. In other words, the same computer-like information processing system believed to be operating in humans is being studied also in animals. Animal memory has been shown to be complex and flexible, and at least some cognitive processes may operate similarly in animals and humans. Laboratory animals are capable of learning diverse and sophisticated concepts. They display mental processes such as coding and organizing symbols, the ability to form abstractions about space, time, and number, and to perceive cause and effect relationships. In addition, their use of tools and other implementations, and their ability to modify tools to operate in different situations, also implies a basic sense of reasoning. Studies of animals ranging from insects to mammals, including bees, pigs, rats, pigeons, chimps, parrots, dolphins, and crows, suggest that animals can perform a variety of cognitive functions. They can form cognitive maps, sense the motives of others, plan ahead by taking into account past experiences, understand the concept of numbers, and solve problems through the use of reason. A variety of studies have shown that parrots and dogs can function intellectually at levels comparable to those of a 2 to 5-year-old human. Pigs can also play video games with joysticks and use mirrors to find food that is located behind them. And in case you had not noticed, honeybees can learn to distinguish human faces. As you might expect, the idea of animal cognition is controversial. Some animal psychologists maintain that the research to date does not sufficiently support the generalization that animal cognition operates in the same way as human cognition. The gap between human and animal functioning proposed by Descartes in the 17th century retains its appeal. Although the chimps are our cousins, it goes to say that chimpanzees are much like our own species. Behavioral psychologists still reject the basic notion of consciousness in animals as well as humans. One behaviorist wrote about cognitive animal psychologists. They are the George Romanesses of the day. Speculating about memory, reasoning, and consciousness in animals is no less ridiculous today than it was 100 years ago. A good historian offered a contradictory view, however. Do animals show all the observable aspects of consciousness? The biological evidence points to a clear yes. They are then likely to have the subjective side as well? Given the long and growing list of similarities, the weight of evidence, it seems to me, is inexorably moving toward yes. My sense is that the scientific community has now swung decisively in its favor. The basic fact has come home at last. We are not the only conscious beings on Earth. If animals are conscious beings and can perform cognitive functions similar to humans, it is also reasonable to ask whether they also display common personality characteristics. A growing number of psychologists believe that the answer is yes. In the early 1990s, 2 psychologists decided to study the 44 red octopuses at the aquarium in Seattle, Washington, where staff scientists and keepers had often noticed what they thought were differing personalities among their charges. Indeed, they had given the creatures names to match their natures. A shy female octopus was called Emily Dickinson, after the poet. Another was so aggressive and destructive she was called Lucretia McEvil, after a hit rock song in the early 1970s by the group Blood, Sweat, and Tears. The psychologist observed the behavior of the octopuses in 3 experimental situations and found that they differed on the factors of activity, reactivity, and avoidance. Their answer to the question, do octopuses have personalities, was a qualified yes, given the different factors on activity, reactivity, and avoidance. Since the time of that research, numerous studies have documented personality characteristics in a variety of animals, including fish, spiders, farm animals, hyenas, guinea pigs, chimps, and dogs. For example, hyenas in a zoo were observed by the keepers to have such distinct human-like characteristics as excitability, sociability, curiosity, and assertiveness. Sheep were judged to differ markedly in shyness versus boldness, and this characteristic affected their behavior. Mice showed some degree of empathy for other mice in pain, as did chimps, elephants, and dolphins. Orangutans, that rated high in extroversion and agreeableness and low in eroticism, were also rated high in the subjective well-being. Again, this is the 5-factor model in psychology. In addition, personality traits exhibited by dogs have been measured as accurately as those in humans. Elephants have been shown to exhibit gentleness, playfulness, exploration, and high levels of activity. Studies of chimps have shown them to exhibit the human personality traits of extroversion, agreeableness, and conscientiousness, and to show the same declines in those characteristics as they get older, just like people do. For examples of these kinds of research, studies on personality characteristics performed on animals, you can see Gosling Trilmich, Hiroyoshi, Weiss, Moss, Miller, Erhard, Seibert, and Perkins. As one animal psychologist has concluded, quote, with the emergence of animal personality studies, we are gaining an even fuller apprehension and appreciation of not only the distinctiveness of birds and beasts and their behaviors, but also their deep resemblances to us and our own behaviors. If animals are so similar to humans in cognitive processing, temperament, and personality, does this lend additional support to the importance of evolution in all living creatures? And as we shall see, the relatively new field of evolutionary psychology is dedicated to investigating this question that if animals are so similar to humans in cognitive processing, temperament, and personality, does this lend additional support to the importance of evolution in all living creatures? With the cognitive movement in experimental psychology and the emphasis on consciousness with humanistic psychology, positive psychology, and post-Freudian psychoanalysis, we have seen that consciousness has reclaimed the central position it has held when psychology started. The dominant view of psychology's subject matter has swung from subjective, with Wundt and Titchener, to objective, with Watson and Skinner, and is now back again to subjective events. Consciousness has made a substantial and vigorous return. As a school of thought, cognitive psychology boasts all the trappings of success. As early as the 1970s, the movement had so many adherents that it could support its own journals. Cognitive Psychology, first published in 1970. Cognition in 1971. Cognitive Science in 1977. Cognitive Therapy and Research in 1977. Journal of Mental Imagery in 1977. And Memory and Cognition in 1983. Consciousness and Cognition began publication in 1992, and the Journal of Consciousness Studies in 1994. Today, there are more than 40 journals dealing with various aspects of cognitive psychology. Jerome Bruner once described cognitive psychology as a revolution whose limits we still cannot fathom. In 1983, Nobel Prize-winning scientist Roger Sperry, who was born in 1913 and died in 1994, commented that compared to the behaviorist and psychoanalytic revolutions in psychology, the cognitive or consciousness revolution is the, quote, most radical turnaround, the most revisionary and transformative, end quote. And he wrote that in 1995. The impact of cognitive psychology has been felt in most areas of interest to psychologists. Further, cognitive psychologists have attempted to expand, extend, and consolidate the work of several major disciplines in a unified and multidisciplinary approach to the study of how the mind acquires knowledge. This perspective, dubbed cognitive science, is an amalgam of cognitive psychology, linguistics, anthropology, philosophy, computer sciences, artificial intelligence, and the neurosciences. Cognitive science laboratories and institutes have been established at universities throughout the United States. Some psychology departments have been renamed cognitive science departments. By whatever name, the cognitive approach to the study of mental phenomena and mental processes has come to dominate psychology and allied disciplines, as we have said before, like linguistics, anthropology, philosophy, computer science, artificial intelligence, and neuroscience, etc. The only feature this new approach shares with its predecessor, behaviorism, is the use of the experimental method. The methods used by cognitive psychologists to study the mind are the same as those used by behaviorists to study behavior, while ignoring or denying the mind. An extension of cognitive psychology, called embedded cognition, recognizes that there are physical aspects of cognition revealed in brain activity and in sensation and perception. It follows then that perceptual and motor response systems affect, direct, and often determine the cognitive processes that occur in the mind. Thus, the mind must be understood in the context of its relationship to a physical body that interacts with the world. For example, it has been shown that something as simple as holding a hot or a cold cup of coffee can affect how we judge or evaluate the personality of another person. Those people who were touching the hot cups have different evaluations of other people than did those holding the cold cups. In another study, carrying light versus heavy clipboards affected how college students evaluated the worth of a foreign currency. Those who carried the heavier clipboards judged the currency to be far more valuable than those who carried the lighter clipboards. Thus, the physical cues gave context to the situation and influenced thought processes, which supports the suggestion that how we process information involves not only the mind but also the body. Another important topic in cognitive psychology is cognitive overload, which deals with the familiar activity known as multitasking. Considerable research has shown that college students who were trying to attend to a variety of electronic images and tasks at the same time performed very poorly. They were not able to focus nearly as well as non-multitaskers. The multitaskers were more easily distracted and had difficulty organizing information and shifting from one task to another. Multitaskers were just lousy at everything, one of the researchers said, and that explains why so many college students walking across their campus did not see the clown in the example we gave earlier. And then also, there's an example of the gorilla coming in during the basketball game. When a large group of students between the ages of 11 and 25 were compared, the younger ones were much less affected by cognitive overload. The older ones, those of college age, did not do nearly as well as the children. So it was suggested that the effects of cognitive overload apparently increase with age. Isn't that something? Well, we have consistently seen and understood that no revolution, however successful, lacks critics. For example, as you would imagine, most Skinnerian behaviorists oppose the cognitive movement. Even those who support it point out weaknesses and limitations, which they should do, noting that there are few concepts that the majority of cognitive psychologists agree upon or consider important, and there remains considerable confusion about terminology and definitions, obviously. Another criticism is directed at an overemphasis on cognition at the expense of other influences on thought and behavior, such as motivation and emotion. The professional literature on motivation and emotion has declined over the last few decades, whereas publications on cognition have increased. Neisser suggested that the result is a narrow and sterile approach to the field, so perhaps we should study motivation and emotion a bit more. Human thinking is passionate and emotional. People operate from complex motives. A computer program, by contrast, has no emotion and is monomaniacal in its single-mindedness. He sensed a danger that cognitive psychology was fixated on thought processes to the same extreme that behaviorism focused only on overt behavior, ignoring all other aspects of human functioning. Cognitive psychology is not finished. Because it is still developing, it is too soon to judge its ultimate fate. It has all the characteristics that every school of thought had at their peak: its own journals, laboratories, meetings, jargon, and convictions, as well as the zeal of righteous believers. Now, we speak of cognitivism as we once did of functionalism and behaviorism. Cognitive psychology has already become what other schools of thought became in their time, part of psychology's mainstream. And that, as we have seen, is the natural progression of all movements and revolutions when they become successful. Evolutionary psychology. Evolutionary psychology has been referred to as the second wave of the cognitive revolution. In this view, the first wave was the new emphasis on consciousness and artificial intelligence. Evolutionary psychology argues that people are biological creatures that have been wired or programmed by evolution to behave, think, feel, and learn in ways that have fostered survival over many generations. This approach is based on the assumption that people with certain behavioral, cognitive, and affective tendencies were more likely to survive and bear and raise children. As one evolutionary psychologist commented, humans who defended territory, nurtured children, and strove for domination were more likely to successfully reproduce than humans who did not do these things, such as defending territory, nurturing children, and striving for domination. With the result that their ultimate descendants, members of the present generation, generally have all of these behavioral tendencies. The genes for those behaviors that facilitate survival were passed on through the generations because they were adaptive, enhancing survival or reproductive success, and eventually they spread widely and became standard equipment. Is biology more important than learning? Well, according to this view, we are shaped as such, if not more by biology than by learning. While not denying that social and cultural forces can influence our behavior through learning, evolutionary psychologists proclaim that we are predisposed at birth to certain ways of behaving as shaped by evolution. Evolutionary psychology deals with 4 fundamental propositions. The first is that all psychological mechanisms at some basic level originate from and owe their existence to evolutionary processes. The second is that Darwin's theories of natural and sexual selection are the most important evolutionary processes responsible for creating evolved psychological mechanisms. The third proposition is that evolved psychological mechanisms can be described as information processing devices. The fourth proposition is that evolved psychological mechanisms are functional. They are functional in the sense that they function to solve recurrent adaptive problems that confronted our ancestors. Evolutionary psychology is a broad field that makes use of research findings from other disciplines, including animal behavior, biology, genetics, neuropsychology, and evolutionary theory. It applies these findings to areas of psychology such as intelligence, personality, and individual differences, social psychology, and risk-taking. We noted earlier in our first reading that psychology today is fragmented into varying approaches to its subject matter, and that there has been no single unifying theme in order to bring these factions together into a single psychology. Proponents of evolutionary psychology claim that their definition can unite this disparate field. A founder of evolutionary psychology, David Buss, who was born in 1953 and is still alive today, wrote that it represents a true scientific revolution, a profound paradigm shift in the field of psychology. He wrote that in 2005. He called evolutionary psychology one of the most important scientific revolutions we have ever had in the history of psychology. Any movement that calls itself evolutionary psychology owes a clear and obvious debt to Charles Darwin. The idea that only those with certain characteristics will survive and reproduce others with these same characteristics is the cornerstone of evolutionary psychology, as it was for Darwin. The emergence of evolutionary psychology and related disciplines signals the fulfillment of Darwin's vision for psychology. To briefly recap, in 1890, 31 years after Darwin published his monumental work on evolution, William James used the term evolutionary psychology in his book, The Principles of Psychology. James predicted that one day psychology would be based on evolutionary theory. He also proposed that much of human behavior is programmed at birth by genetic predispositions he called instincts. These instinctive behaviors could be modified by experience or learning, but initially they are formed independently of experience. James argued that a wide range of behaviors were instinctive, including fears of specific objects such as snakes, strange animals, and heights, all of which have obvious survival value. Other instinctive behaviors James discussed were parenting skills, love, sociability, and pugnacity, the tendency to quarrel and fight. James argued that instinctive behaviors evolved through a natural selection and were adaptations designed to cope with specific problems of survival and reproduction. We understand that during the reign of behaviorism from 1913 to about 1960, the notion that any behavior might be determined genetically was anathema, or cursed. All behavior was learned, declared the behaviorists. However, even during their years of supremacy and effective domination of psychology, there were scattered reports of genetic influences and inherited tendencies taking precedence over conditioned responses. For example, in earlier readings, we discussed the work of B.F. Skinner's students, the Brelands, who trained animals to perform for the IQ, or intelligence quotient zoo, television commercials, and state fairs. Some of their animals demonstrated a tendency toward instinctive drift. The animals sometimes substituted instinctive behaviors for those that had been reinforced with food even when the instinctive behaviors interfered with obtaining food, a clear violation of the basic behavioristic principle that reinforcement rules all. So, you may already be familiar with the monkey mother love research of psychologist Harry Harlow, but if you have not, you should know that Harlow raised baby monkeys with artificial mothers of two types. Both were constructed of wire mesh, but one was covered in soft, cuddly terry cloth, while the other was hard, uncovered, and contained a nipple for dispensing milk. To B.F. Skinnerians, it was obvious that reinforcement would be associated only with the hard mother that supplied the reward of milk. When the monkeys were frightened, however, they clung tightly to the terry cloth mother, not the one that had always supplied reinforcement. It would seem that some other guiding force was at work that could not be explained by operant conditioning and reinforcement. Research conducted by Martin Seligman, who later founded positive psychology, showed that it was easy to condition people to fear snakes, insects, dogs, heights, and tunnels. It was harder, however, to condition them to fear more neutral or less threatening objects, such as a car or a screwdriver. A fear of snakes has always been useful for survival and evolution, and so presumably we are born wired with this predisposing tendency. Fearing a neutral object, on the other hand, has had no survival value over the generations, and so has not been passed on. Seligman called this phenomenon biological preparedness. This idea suggests that phobias are indeed learned through classical conditioning, but that certain fears that may have served some adaptive purpose in stressful environments are more readily conditionable. The cognitive revolution was also a precursor of evolutionary psychology. The cognitive movement likened the human mind to a computer that could process whatever information it received. Part of the computer metaphor of the mind is the realization that the mind, like a computer, must be programmed to perform its multitude of tasks. Thus, evolutionary psychology both draws on the cognitive revolution and expands its importance as a necessary framework within which to understand human and animal nature. It focuses on the importance of consciousness as it has evolved over time, and it places a greater emphasis on the notion of the computer as a metaphor for all conscious processes. Two leading evolutionary psychologists wrote, "The programs comprising the human mind were designed by natural selection to solve the adaptive problems regularly faced by our hunter-gatherer ancestors, problems such as finding a mate, cooperating with others, hunting, gathering, protecting their children, navigating, avoiding predators, avoiding exploitation, etc. The brain's evolved functions is to extract information from the environment and use that information to generate behavior and regulate physiology. Hence, the brain is not just like a computer. It is a computer that is a physical system that was designed to process information." Another influence is that of sociobiology. Another impetus for evolutionary psychology occurred in 1975 when Edward O. Wilson, a biologist, published a groundbreaking book titled Sociobiology with the subtitle A New Synthesis. The book was both hailed and reviled as was Wilson himself. 2 years later, it was featured on the cover of Time magazine, and Wilson was awarded the National Medal of Science. He also had a pitcher of ice water poured over his head that year at the annual meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, an organization not noted for violence. Wilson's bold and simple thesis was an effort to many people because it challenged their cherished belief that everyone is created equal and that environmental and social forces alone can improve human development. Wilson angered people by appearing to argue that genetic influences may be more important than cultural ones. If all behavior is determined genetically, then it follows that there is no hope of changing it through child-rearing practices, Head Start programs, or any other way. That was not Wilson's central point, however, though he did take a strong hereditarian position at a time when such a view was cursed. Wilson wrote, "Human beings inherit a propensity to acquire behavior in social structures, a propensity that is shared by enough people to be called human nature. The defining traits include division of labor between the sexes, bonding between parents and children, heightened altruism towards the closest kin, incest avoidance, other forms of ethical behavior, suspicion of strangers, tribalism, dominance orders within groups, male dominance overall, and territorial aggression over limited resources. Although people have free will and the choice to turn in many directions, the channels of their psychological development are nevertheless, however much we might wish otherwise, cut more deeply by genes in certain directions than others. As a result of the outcry over Wilson's book, the word sociobiology developed such a negative connotation that it was dropped from use. In 1989, when a group of American scientists decided to form a professional association in order to study the field, Wilson began, they called it the Human Behavior and Evolution Society, and tried not to use the word sociobiology at their meetings. The field of study that Wilson started became incorporated into the changing views of a number of American psychologists who called their work evolutionary psychology. Under that more acceptable name, the field became immensely popular. Evolutionary psychology deals with evolved psychological mechanisms that are wired or programmed into human cognition and behavior because they have been successful in solving problems of survival and reproduction in the organism's evolutionary history. The approach has become highly influential and is occupying a central role in cognitive neuroscience. Despite the popularity of evolutionary psychology, it has generated considerable criticism, as every new movement does. As we saw with sociobiology, people who believe that humans are solely, or at least primarily, products of learning oppose any discussion of biological determinants of behavior. If human nature is determined by genetic endowment alone, then there is no possibility of positive social and cultural forces changing behavior for the better or for people to try to exercise free will. The evolutionary psychologist's response to this criticism is to note, as Wilson did earlier, that they do not claim that all behavior is immutably determined by our genes. Human behavior is changeable. We remain free to choose, although I say that we don't. We actually are determined by multiple factors. But anyways, social and cultural forces are influential and sometimes override or alter inherited programming to respond in certain ways. Opponents argue that the breadth of the field makes the theory difficult to test in any convincing way. The ability of evolutionary psychology to explain nearly everything is not an absolute virtue. Critics also question how it is possible to clearly link or connect a history of adaptation in a particular behavior through hundreds of generations to primitive peoples where the survival value of the behavior presumably originated. And as we have seen, it is history in the making. There is no end to the development of different schools of psychology, as we have understood through this reading that every new approach to psychology, every new attempt to define and redefine the field, has had critics and points of apparent vulnerability. As with cognitive psychology, it is too early in the development of evolutionary psychology to judge its ultimate value. It, too, is history in the making, so we don't rightly know about it as much as we would like. One advocate of the evolutionary psychology movement summed up the current status of the field in these terms. We now have a powerful principle that will eventually provide a foundation for a deeper and richer psychology. But we have a lot of work to do. And that is what Neisser quoted at Google in 2000. And so the search for the truly definitive approach to psychology, for the ultimate school of thought that might characterize the field for more than a few decades, still continues. Will evolutionary psychology or cognitive psychology become that final arbiter of what psychology ought to be and do? Based on what we have seen so far, probably not. All we can say, however, with certainty, is that if the history of psychology as we have recounted it thus far tells us anything, it is that when a movement becomes formalized into a school of thought, it gains momentum that can be stopped only by its success in overthrowing the established position. When that happens, the unobstructive arteries of the once vigorous youthful movement begin to harden, flexibility turns to rigidity, revolutionary passion turns to protect the position, and eyes and minds begin to close to new ideas. In this way, new establishments are born. So it is in the progress of any science, an evolutionary building to ever higher levels of development. There is no completion, no finish, no final state, just a newer ending process of growth as newer species evolve from older ones and attempt to adapt to an ever-changing environment.